I was added to the Slack channel at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, a private group called Leadership Strategic Planning that I had not known existed until the notification appeared on my screen. And within 30 seconds of joining, I understood that I had been added not to participate, but to be the subject of a conversation that had been happening without me for weeks. The company was Meridian Analytics, a data consulting firm in Boston with about 350 employees, and I had been the director of client delivery for 4 years, responsible for managing the team that executed analytics engagements for our Fortune 500 clients, and ensuring that projects were delivered on time, on budget, and to the quality standards that justified our premium pricing. The channel had 23 members, all of them senior leaders, and the conversation thread I landed in the middle of was a discussion about my performance, my management style, and whether I was the right fit for the leadership team going forward. The messages were not tagged to me. No one had notified me that this conversation was happening. I had been added mid-thread, and the only reason I could see for that addition was that someone wanted me to know what they had been saying about me, either as a form of intimidation or as a prelude to a decision that had already been made. The messages were brutal in the way that digital communication enables, the kind of casual cruelty that people deploy when they believe they are speaking in private and that the target will never see their words. The VP of Sales had written that my team was too slow and risk-averse, that clients were complaining about delays and lack of innovation, and that I was creating a bottleneck by insisting on process adherence that other firms had moved beyond. The chief strategy officer had added that I seemed resistant to the company's growth initiatives and that my leadership style was better suited to a legacy consulting model than the agile, client-centric approach Meridian was trying to build. The chief operating officer had contributed a comment about how my insistence on documented requirements and change order processes was making us look inflexible to clients, and that the company needed leaders who could say yes more often and figure out how to deliver later. And then there was a message from the CEO, Daniel Rourke, that made my stomach tight. He said that he appreciated my operational discipline, but that leadership at Meridian required a different skill set now, and that he was evaluating whether a structural change in client delivery might be needed to better align with the firm's strategic direction. The thread continued for another dozen messages discussing potential organizational changes, alternative leadership structures, and the timeline for making decisions, and then I had been added to the channel. No explanation, no greeting. Just my name appearing in the member list while the conversation sat there, frozen, waiting for me to read it. I did not respond immediately. I took a screenshot of the entire thread, saved it to my personal cloud storage, and then I opened my archived emails and Slack messages and started searching for patterns. If this conversation had been happening for weeks, there would be evidence elsewhere: forwarded client complaints, performance concerns raised in other channels, documented issues that justified the narrative being constructed about my work. What I found instead was the opposite. I pulled client satisfaction scores for the past 2 years and found that my team consistently scored in the top quartile for delivery quality, communication, and client relationship management. I pulled project financial data and found that my team's utilization rates and margin performance exceeded company averages, that we had a lower rate of scope creep and change orders than other delivery teams, and that client renewals for accounts I managed were running at 87% compared to a company average of 71%. I reviewed the feedback from my most recent 360 review, conducted 6 months earlier, and found that while some peers had noted that I was detail-oriented and process-focused, the overall assessment had been strongly positive, and my manager at the time, who had since left the company, had rated me as exceeding expectations with a recommendation for expanded leadership responsibility. None of this aligned with the narrative in the Slack channel. What I was reading there was not an evidence-based assessment of performance, but a pre-constructed justification for a decision that had already been made for reasons that had nothing to do with my actual work. The context I needed came from a conversation I had with my counterpart in the product development group, a woman named Rachel who had also been managing her team through Meridian's recent strategic shifts. Over coffee 2 weeks earlier, Rachel had mentioned casually that the executive team was under pressure from the private equity firm that had acquired a majority stake in Meridian 18 months ago, and that the PE firm's operating partner was pushing for cost optimization and organizational restructuring to improve EBITDA margins before a planned exit in 2 years. She said there had been talk about flattening the management structure, reducing headcount in operational roles, and shifting resources toward revenue-generating functions, and that several mid-level leaders had been quietly managed out through performance improvement plans or restructuring over the past 6 months. At the time, I had not connected that information to my own situation because my team's performance was strong and I had received no indication that my role was at risk. But now, reading the Slack thread, I understood what was happening. I was not being removed for performance reasons. I was being removed because my role and the headcount that reported through it represented a cost center that the PE firm wanted to compress, and the executive team was constructing a narrative that would justify that decision while avoiding the appearance of arbitrary layoffs. The humiliation was not just that they were discussing my removal in a private channel. It was that they had added me to that channel so I would see the conversation, so I would understand that my fate had been decided and that my options were to accept it quietly or fight back and be labeled as difficult and resistant to change. It was a calculated move designed to demoralize, to make me feel isolated and without recourse, and to position my inevitable departure as a mutual decision or a performance-based necessity rather than what it actually was. A cost-cutting measure disguised as strategic realignment. I sat at my desk staring at the messages and felt the cold, sharp clarity that comes when you realize that professional courtesy and evidence-based performance management are not universal principles, but contextual luxuries that disappear when financial pressures override them. And I made a decision. If they wanted to remove me, they would have to do it honestly and publicly, and they would have to confront the gap between the narrative they were building and the documented reality of my work. I spent the next 3 days compiling a comprehensive dossier on my team's performance and my leadership outcomes. I pulled every client satisfaction survey, every project financial report, every delivery milestone, and every piece of feedback I had received over the past 4 years. I created a summary document showing client retention rates, margin performance, team utilization, and quality metrics, with comparison benchmarks against other teams in the firm. I included email threads where clients had specifically praised my team's work, where they had renewed contracts and expanded scopes, and where they had recommended Meridian to other potential clients based on their experience working with my group. I documented the process improvements my team had implemented that had reduced project overruns and improved delivery predictability, and I included financial analyses showing the cost savings and revenue protection those improvements had generated. And then I did something that felt both necessary and risky. I documented the organizational changes that had occurred over the past 18 months since the PE acquisition, including the leaders who had been pushed out, the restructuring initiatives that had been announced and then quietly reversed when they failed, and the pattern of private channel conversations where performance narratives were constructed without the involvement of the people being evaluated. I did not name individuals or make accusations. I simply presented a timeline and a pattern, and I let the data speak. The catalyst came 5 days after I had been added to the Slack channel, when I received a calendar invite for a meeting with Daniel Rourke and the head of HR scheduled for the following afternoon. The meeting had no agenda, but the timing and the participants made its purpose clear. This was the conversation where I would be told that my role was being eliminated or restructured, where I would be offered a separation package in exchange for a non-disparagement agreement, and where I would be expected to exit quietly and professionally. I accepted the meeting invite, and then I did something that most people in my position would not have done. I requested that the meeting be expanded to include the full executive leadership team, framing it as an opportunity to discuss strategic alignment and organizational effectiveness in client delivery. Daniel's assistant responded within an hour saying that the executive team's calendars were full but that we could schedule a follow-up session if needed after the initial conversation. I replied that I understood, but that given the scope of the topics I wanted to discuss, including client retention, margin performance, and delivery quality benchmarks, I believed it would be more efficient to have the full leadership team present rather than requiring multiple sessions. I copied the Chief Operating Officer and the Chief Strategy Officer, both of whom had participated in the Slack channel discussion, and I attached a one-page summary of the performance data I wanted to review. The response came from Daniel himself 30 minutes later. The meeting would be expanded as requested and moved to the large conference room. The expanded meeting happened the next day at 2 p.m. in the glass-walled executive conference room that faced the main office floor, visible to anyone walking past. Daniel opened by saying that he appreciated my proactive approach to discussing organizational alignment, and that he wanted to have a candid conversation about how client delivery was positioned for the firm's next phase of growth. Before he could continue, I asked if I could provide some context by sharing the performance summary I had prepared. He looked momentarily uncertain. This was not the script he had expected, but he agreed. I connected my laptop to the conference room display and opened my presentation. The first slide showed client satisfaction scores for my team compared to firm averages over a 2-year period. My team's scores were consistently higher. The second slide showed project margin performance. My team's margins exceeded company averages by 11 percentage points. The third slide showed client retention and contract renewal rates. My team's retention rate was 16 points higher than the firm average. I advanced through the slides methodically without commentary, letting the data establish the foundation. Then I paused and said that I wanted to address a specific concern that had been raised about my leadership approach. I put up a slide showing the thread from the Leadership Strategic Planning Slack channel. I had redacted the individual names and replaced them with role titles: VP Sales, Chief Strategy Officer, COO, CEO, but the messages were otherwise unaltered, and they were now displayed in full on a 70-inch screen in front of the entire executive team and the head of HR. The room went silent. The messages about my being too slow, too risk-averse, too focused on process, about needing a structural change, about evaluating my fit, all of it was there, visible, undeniable. I said that I had been added to this channel 5 days earlier and had seen this conversation, and that I wanted to address the concerns that had been raised with evidence rather than perception. I advanced to the next slide, which showed specific client feedback praising my team's responsiveness, quality, and partnership approach. I showed emails from clients thanking us for catching scope issues early and preventing cost overruns. I showed project retrospectives where delivery excellence had led to contract expansions. I showed timeline data demonstrating that my team's delivery cycles were actually faster than other teams when measured from contract signature to final deliverable, because we front-loaded requirements gathering and change management to avoid mid-project chaos. I then addressed the comment about resistance to growth initiatives and said I wanted to clarify what that actually meant in practice. I put up a slide showing 3 initiatives that had been launched by the executive team over the past year and quietly abandoned after they failed. A rapid delivery model that had resulted in client complaints and scope disputes, a resource sharing program that had created accountability gaps and delivery delays, and a tiered service offering that had confused clients and reduced renewals. I showed the internal post-mortems from those initiatives, documents that had been circulated to delivery leaders but apparently not reviewed by the executives who had championed them. And I highlighted the common theme: initiatives that prioritize speed and cost reduction over delivery quality and client partnership had consistently failed to produce sustainable results. I said that my resistance to certain growth initiatives was not resistance to growth itself, but resistance to approaches that I believed, based on data and client feedback, would damage the firm's reputation and client relationships. And I noted that my team's performance metrics suggested that this judgment had been correct. The room remained silent. Daniel's face was unreadable, but the Chief Operating Officer looked uncomfortable, and the VP of Sales was staring at his laptop screen rather than at the presentation. I advanced to my final slide, which showed a simple comparison: the cost structure of my client delivery team versus the revenue and margin contribution we generated, and a projection of what would happen to client retention and project margins if the team were restructured or eliminated. The analysis showed that while my team represented a fixed cost that could be reduced in the short term, the revenue impact from lower retention and margin erosion would exceed the cost savings within 2 quarters, and the reputational damage would take years to recover. I concluded by saying that I understood the firm was under pressure to optimize costs and improve financial performance, and that I was open to discussing how client delivery could contribute to those goals, but that any organizational changes should be based on evidence and long-term strategic impact rather than narrative construction in private channels. Then I closed the laptop and sat down. No one spoke for what felt like a very long time but was probably only 20 seconds. Then the head of HR, a pragmatic woman named Janet who had seen enough corporate politics to recognize when a situation had shifted, said that she appreciated the data I had presented and that she thought the leadership team needed time to process it and discuss next steps. Daniel said something about the value of candid dialogue and the importance of aligning around facts, and the meeting adjourned with a vague commitment to reconvene. As people filed out of the conference room, I noticed that several employees who had been walking past had stopped and were looking through the glass walls, clearly aware that something significant had just happened even if they could not hear the details. The Slack channel messages on the big screen had been visible to anyone passing by for at least 10 minutes before I had closed my laptop, and while the names had been redacted, the content was damning enough on its own. Senior leaders discussing a colleague's fitness for leadership in a private channel, making judgments without evidence, constructing a narrative to justify a predetermined decision. The fallout was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Within hours, word had spread through the office that I had confronted the executive team with evidence of private channel discussions about my performance, and that I had systematically dismantled the narrative they had been building with client data and financial analysis. The story took on a life of its own, with details being added and embellished, but the core remained accurate. The leadership team had been caught discussing a personnel decision in a way that revealed their actual motivations and their disregard for evidence-based management. Several employees who had felt similarly targeted or undermined in recent months reached out to me privately, some sharing their own experiences of being discussed in channels they were not part of, others expressing frustration with the gap between the firm's stated values around transparency and collaboration and the actual practices of the leadership team. 2 of the senior consultants who reported to other delivery directors told me they had lost confidence in the executive team's judgment and were considering leaving the firm. The private equity firm's operating partner, who had been copied on some follow-up emails related to the meeting, requested a call with Daniel and Janet to understand what had happened and why organizational decisions were being made in a way that created legal and reputational risk. That call, I later learned from Janet, had not gone well for Daniel. The operating partner had asked why performance-based decisions were being discussed in Slack channels rather than through formal performance management processes, why a high-performing leader had been targeted for removal without documentation of performance issues, and why the firm's stated cost optimization strategy was being implemented in a way that appeared to violate basic principles of fair treatment and evidence-based decision-making. The operating partner had also asked whether there were other situations where similar private channel discussions had influenced personnel decisions, and whether the firm had exposure to wrongful termination or discrimination claims as a result. Janet had been forced to admit that she did not know because much of the decision-making was happening in channels that HR was not part of, and that left no formal documentation trail. The meeting that had been scheduled to discuss my separation was quietly canceled and replaced with a series of one-on-one conversations where Daniel and Janet attempted to rebuild the relationship and reframe the situation. Daniel told me that the Slack channel discussion had been taken out of context, that it had been part of a broader strategic planning conversation, and that the concerns raised were meant to be developmental feedback rather than grounds for termination. I did not argue with this reframing, but I also did not accept it. I said that developmental feedback was typically delivered directly to the person being developed, through formal review processes and with an opportunity for dialogue, and that what had happened in the Slack channel was neither developmental nor feedback, but rather narrative construction designed to justify a predetermined outcome. I said that I was willing to continue in my role if the firm was committed to evidence-based performance management and transparent decision-making, but that I would not operate in an environment where my job security depended on private channel politics rather than measurable results. Daniel said he understood and that he was committed to improving communication and decision-making processes going forward. The structural changes that had been planned for client delivery were quietly shelved. No formal announcement was made, but the organizational chart remained unchanged and my team's headcount was not reduced. Over the next 3 months, 2 members of the executive team who had been most vocal in the Slack channel left the firm, one for what was described as a planned retirement, the other for a role at another company. And I suspected that the private equity firm had made it clear that leadership changes were needed if the firm was going to be positioned for a successful exit. Daniel remained as CEO but with visibly less autonomy, and the operating partner became much more involved in strategic decisions and organizational planning. I also noticed that Slack usage among the leadership team dropped significantly, with more conversations happening in scheduled meetings and documented email threads, and that HR began implementing more formal performance management processes with required documentation and review cycles. I stayed at Meridian for another 14 months, not because the environment became ideal, but because I had proven a point and because my team's work continued to matter. The firm ultimately completed its exit through a strategic sale to a larger consulting company, and I transitioned out during the integration not because I was pushed out but because I had other opportunities and because I had accomplished what I needed to accomplish. The story of the Slack channel confrontation became part of Meridian's internal lore, one of those moments that gets referenced obliquely in conversations about transparency and leadership accountability. And I heard from several people over the following years that it had changed how performance discussions were conducted and how private channel communications were managed. They humiliated me in the group chat, adding me mid-conversation so I would see myself being discussed and judged by people who had not bothered to review the evidence of my work. One forward, one decision to put those messages on a screen in front of the people who wrote them and the broader organization that could see through the glass, turned the whole office silent and forced a reckoning between narrative and reality. It did not destroy careers or create dramatic public consequences, but it ended a pattern of decision-making that had been corroding the firm's culture and exposing it to legal and operational risk, and it established that evidence and documentation would matter more than private consensus when evaluating performance and making personnel decisions. That was enough.